A weekly wrap-up of the ongoing conflict in eastern Ukraine, with civilians trapped by heavy shelling, desperately trying to flee to safety. While US politicians call to provide weapons to Kiev forces, Europe encourages diplomacy, pushing a peace plan that sees more autonomy for the east of Ukraine. And as a new government in Greece tries to charm creditors in Europe, EU leaders express their stance on Athens' debt in no uncertain terms. Hello there, you're watching RT International. You're with me, Katie Pilbeam. It's just gone midday here in the Russian capital. Through the week, the fighting in eastern Ukraine has been increasingly looking like a full-scale war. Civilians have been constantly coming under rocket fire from Ukrainian artillery. In the city of Donetsk this week, a number of residential buildings, a school and a hospital were hit, forcing locals to flee to bomb shelters and basements.
За что нас? Мы люди, мы обыкновенные мирные люди. За что убивать нас?
Подошел к больнице.
Сразу взрыв.
Начали бомбить. Когда девочка бежит, я открыл дверь, ее пропустил.
У нас в Углегорске столько трупов валяется, никто не выводит, раненые истекают кровью. Никто не хоронит, потому что постоянные обстрелы.
Indeed, the number of those killed and injured is mounting day by day. RT's Roman Kotarev visited one grieving family whose surviving members are recovering from the shelling.
Tamara lost her right leg. That's why she said she could not save one of her children.
Если б не нога, я бы его спасла. Я не могла просто встать и откопать его полностью. Я очень кричала, никто не пришел. Потом уже муж прибежал.
The rockets started falling when Tamara's husband was almost home. He witnessed his house suffering a direct hit.
Вот сразу на входе был сын, у него сильно рассечена была голова, кровь текла, он так висел нос, глаз был открытый полностью, рассечение сильное было. Я его замотал в куртку, выкопал быстренько и занес в погреб, потому что еще обстрелы сыпались в этот момент. Потом уже нашел ее, она лежала тоже приваленная, была присыпана, но голова была видна. Я ее тоже откопал, она кричала: «Сын еще дышит». Когда я достал, уже ребенок не дышал.
With the city under constant artillery fire, medics were unable to reach the family.
Нас эвакуировали ополченцы на грузовой машине крытой. Откачивали, не откачали, он задохнулся. Его не было ни ушибов, ничего. Просто задохнулся.
The family's youngest son, Artyom, has already been buried, and now they just hope their eldest won't be left with permanent disabilities. A fragment of a shell struck Misha in his face and body. After 2 operations, he needs further surgery, which can't be carried out in Donetsk. A Russian-based international charity is now working to bring Misha to Moscow to get the help he needs. But there are many families here with similar tragedies and nowhere to go. Roman Kosarev, RT, Donetsk.
It seems the civil war raging in eastern Ukraine isn't what Western top brass are interested in. They're playing the blame game.
Russia and the separatists are seizing more territory, terrorizing more citizens.
As you know, the Russians have continued to supply heavy equipment, tanks, armored personnel carriers, artillery.
Aggressive actions we have seen of Russia in Ukraine.
Russia's aggression against Ukraine is a heinous and deadly affront.
Facing such accusations at the Munich Security Conference on Saturday, Russia's foreign minister says it's a trend to blame Moscow without presenting any solid evidence.
In every destabilizing situation, our US partners blame Russia. Our Western partners actually support the Kiev military operation and every turn try to justify the use of cluster munitions. Meanwhile, the US says it has evidence against Russia without specifying what it is.
That statement came during the Munich Security Conference on Saturday, where the Ukrainian crisis dominated. The bones of a new peace plan were also laid out there. The French president, who's visited Kiev and Moscow along with the German chancellor, revealed initial details of the agreement. Peter Oliver has the details.
Some of the main points of that is we would see a 50 to 70 kilometre demilitarised zone between the Ukrainian army forces and those forces that are fighting for the self-proclaimed republics in the east of Ukraine. That, of course, would cut down on the potential threats to civilians from shelling in those areas. Also, we would see greater autonomy for those self-proclaimed republics. Now, speaking about this, François Hollande, the French president, said that this was really essential due to the bloody nature of the conflict that's erupted in Ukraine. And also, we heard that Russia is willing to act as a guarantor for any agreements that can be made between Kiev and those self-proclaimed republics in the east. But what we are going to see is more talks by key people on the international stage. We're looking at the likes of the French foreign minister, also US Secretary of State John Kerry going to be talking here. But what we are expecting now on Ukraine is perhaps a phone call between the president of Russia, the president of Ukraine, the president of France and the German chancellor. All of those people expected to be on the phone to discuss that peace plan that was somewhat leaked by French President François Hollande.
War can't come too soon for eastern Ukrainians, who are discovering evidence of ever more dreadful weapons used on their cities. Now, here is one of those weapons, a tactical missile the anti-government fighters say they intercepted before it reached the city of Lugansk. When its warhead exploded, the noise was so loud, locals thought an airplane had crashed nearby. Let's have a look at some of the weapons which anti-government fighters claim have been used on civilian areas by the Ukrainian army. The missile you just saw is a powerful short-range ballistic missile designed to destroy targets like helicopter launch pads, ammunition depots and command posts. And rockets from this launcher can hit targets within 35 kilometres and leave 4-metre deep and 8-metre wide craters. And this weapon here then, also reportedly used in eastern Ukraine, is even more powerful. It can fire rockets carrying different types of warheads up to 120 kilometres and is able to completely ruin a whole small town. Now, again this week, this was seen in the skies over Donetsk. It's suspected that it could be incendiary munitions, which international conventions ban from use in civilian populated areas. Back in July, they were reportedly dropped on cities controlled by anti-government forces. Well, international observers have previously caught the Ukrainian army using prohibited weapons. The use of cluster bombs in populated areas was confirmed by the Human Rights Watch in October. The watchdog's reports stress this could amount to war crimes. But for some, US politicians, that is, Kiev's use of cluster bombs is justifiable.
I think that if we would have provided them with the weapons they need, they wouldn't have had to use cluster bombs. It's partially our fault.
And calls from Washington and Kiev to start shipping are growing louder.
We will continue to provide Ukraine with security assistance.
Frankly speaking, we would be happy to get more, including defensive weapon, lethal weapon, and so on and so forth.
However, European politicians are not so keen to provide weapons to Ukraine. The UK is not going to help Kiev with lethal military assistance. France is taking the same stance. Sending weapons to one side of the conflict doesn't seem a very consistent step. That sentiment is coming from Brussels. Italy thinks it's time to lower the temperature of the crisis instead of raising it. And Angela Merkel firmly declares that Berlin will not support Ukraine with weapons. However, her decision caused a fiery response from some conference members.
Here's the problem I have with the Chancellor's position. She can't see how arming people who are willing to fight and die for their freedom makes things better. And to now turn our back on this struggling democracy, and that's exactly what you're doing, in my view, when you turn down a reasonable request to help defend oneself, is not our finest hour.
Some of those who might have benefited from possible weapon shipments from the West have this week turned their anger against authorities in Kiev. These are volunteers who've been fighting against anti-government forces in eastern Ukraine, angry at the government's decision to reorganize their unit. They tried to storm a presidential administration building. Journalist and broadcaster Neil Clark believes this highlights the divisions between those who toppled Ukrainian authorities last year.
It's not the first time this has happened. We had we had demonstrations last week in Kiev. We had President Poroshenko booed when he went to Maidan. I think what this reflects really is the deep and growing divisions in amongst the pro-Putsch, the pro-Maidan factions, if we can call them that, in Ukraine. What brought them together 12 months ago was their determination to topple the government of Yanukovych. But really, they were a very disparate group of people, ranging from neo-Nazis, far-right ultranationalists to, if you like, pro-Western globalists.
Some of the protesters' comrades are still fighting in eastern Ukraine. The fiercest of those battles are focused around the town of Debaltsevo. Anti-government fighters say they've surrounded several thousand Ukrainian troops there. Skirmishes there have been non-stop for 2 weeks now. Ukrainian generals deny their forces are surrounded, saying supply lines are under their control and anti-government fighters can't completely encircle them. Well, let's take a look then at this map. So Debaltsevo, as you can see, is right in the middle of Lugansk and Donetsk, just here. Now, it's a railroad hub as well, which is important. That's why people want to get to it. Now, this is how the front line looks right now, according to anti-government forces, that is. Civilians caught in the fighting are desperate to flee.
Кромешный ад. Родители остались там. Отец с матерью остались. Нас там страшны. Мы еле выехали. Дебальцево очень страшно. Стреляют со всех сторон. И не поймешь, куда стреляют, и зачем стреляют, и кто стреляет. Вас обманули, что ли? Вчера выехали наши друзья. Вчера открыли. Мы вчера побоялись, потому что в спину стреляли, ехали. Просто стреляли в спину.
But the supposedly safe humanitarian corridors turn out to be extremely dangerous. Our own crew came under fire as they were travelling with an evacuation convoy sent by anti-government fighters. Well, you can find a full report on that incident, as well as the dramatic pictures, stories from war-torn east of Ukraine. That's all the details on our website, rt.com.